In the early 20th century, the country was abuzz with their fascination with flight. There were barnstormers and wing walkers, air shows and air races. People far and wide fell in love with the airplane. And what it could do for the country. The need to establish an airmail service soon became evident. The development of the airplane was going to allow the country to communicate with each other quicker and speed up the flow of information through the postal service. It meant progress. The country was growing and moving forward through the advancement of aviation. After a series of demonstration flights between 1911 and 1918, domestic U.S. airmail was formally established as a new class of service by the United States Post Office Department. Among these pioneers in this airmail system was several QBs. Word of the QB organization was spread across the nation by airmail pilots and those pilots in the Ford Air Tours. The early airmail pilots were show-offs, drinkers, smokers, hellraisers, and some of the gutsiest men in the country. Being paid to fly visually into nearly impossible weather conditions, they were the risk-takers of their time. QBs were pioneers in the airmail business, and sadly, many would die while leading the way. On May 15, 1918, the Post Office's first airmail flight would take off from Washington, D.C. This new service would link the nation's capital to New York via Philadelphia. President Woodrow Wilson was on hand to kick off the proceedings with a piece of mail to be delivered on the inaugural flight. Non-QB Army pilot Lieutenant George Boyle took off in his Curtiss Jenny to carry the mail north. Instead, he headed south. Instructed to use the train tracks as a guide from the air, Boyle became confused and followed the wrong set of railroad tracks. Realizing this, he landed 18 minutes later near Waldorf, Maryland. Breaking his prop during his hard landing, the mail then had to be trucked to Washington to be flown again the very next day. Boyle's flight was an ominous start to a series of accidents that the airmail pilots would incur. The dangers of flying at the dawn of aviation were plentiful. Pilots were taking recently developed machines into a new environment, unaware of all that could go wrong. They were explorers of the sky and experimenters testing the scientific conditions of flight and Mother Nature. They were learning how to fly in these brand new machines. Still in its infancy, aviation was more experimental than an established transportation system. Most flying was done in good weather, along established short passages. An airmail service that relied on new cross-country routes with poor navigational aids, forced by the pressures of a rigid flight schedule, presented numerous problems. Accidents were frequent and killed 31 of the first 40 pilots hired during the first 2 years of operation. Statistically, one pilot died per month while flying the mail. They got into airplanes when it was the riskiest business in the country. Because of these dangerous operations, if a QB missed a QB gathering, he would call to let his buddies know that he was only out of town, but still alive. This tradition continues today. It was a time where the front page news was constantly scattered with headlines of pilots who were killed in crashes throughout the country. In fact, on a Michigan newspaper's front page, there were 3 separate articles about 3 different crashes, all reported in one day on September 18, 1927. Many pilots would become disoriented while flying in the clouds, without the proper instruments to help right themselves. They battled things like structural and engine failure, fires, losing their direction, fog, snow, and the gloom of night along the U.S. transcontinental airway to bring the mail through. In Curtiss Jennies and de Havilland Fours, these pioneer pilots risked their lives to establish the world's first scheduled air transport system. One of the first QB AirMail pilots was Elmer Partridge. The 38-year-old was to make the inaugural flight from St. Paul, Minnesota to Chicago. However, the winds were so intense that he didn't make it more than 4 miles from the airport, with his plane tossing about from side to side. In spite of his valiant efforts, Partridge plunged into a cornfield at a steep angle. This QB sign-in sheet from 1926 is one of the earliest QB written documents. It records the members present who gave Partridge a silent toast, the most sacred tradition of all QBs, now and then. QB Dean Smith had 900 hours of flying time under his belt when he joined the airmail service in 1920. On one of his flights, he had to make an emergency landing. His telegram describes the incident. On trip number 4 westbound, flying low, engine quit, only place to land on cow, killed cow, wrecked plane, scared me, Smith. Except for the cow, it was more or less a routine flight for an airmail pilot of the 1920s, and the account of it sets the tone for the early days of flying in America. In 1927, he flew the inaugural contract airmail flight from Providence to New York. He was a pilot on QB Richard E. Byrd's Antarctic expedition in 1928 and 1929. Test pilot and QB Eddie Allen became an airmail pilot in 1925, after serving as an instructor pilot in World War I. Allen made a number of forced landings due to weather conditions. In one instance, he hit a horse and carriage. The horse, carriage, and driver were all unhurt. The plane's lower left wing and fuselage suffered so much damage, the plane had to be trucked back to the airfield. Allen was, some would argue, the best test pilot ever. So much so that some insurance companies would only insure flights if Allen were at the controls. However, at the age of 46, Allen was killed in the testing of the XB-29 in 1943. Hap Arnold bought the B-29 on paper before there were prototypes. The test planes that came off the line had serious issues, one of which was the insufficient cooling of the rear bank of cylinders. As a result, Allen had an engine fire. Despite much effort to fly the plane back to the airfield, he was unable to do so with smoke trailing from one engine. Unable to maintain altitude, the B-29 crashed into a meatpacking plant with heavy loss of life. Airmail pilot and QB Harold T. Slim Lewis was one of the service's most colorful pilots. Noted for his daring and speed, it was said that adventure was his middle name. Said to be a well-liked showman and a good pilot. He was considered the ace of the whole bunch. Lewis always seemed to get through, even when other pilots couldn't. While flying the mail, Lewis is said to have buzzed the courthouse at Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, so closely that he set the weather vane spinning. Fellow pilot Dean Smith remembered Lewis as someone who could drink more and fly better than anyone else I knew. Dean remembered once Lewis showed up for a trip stumbling and weaving, but somehow still managed to fly and flew his trip superbly. Quoted as saying, An instrument panel is just something to clutter up the cockpit and distract your attention from the railroad or riverbed you're following. Flying by the seat of his pants resulted in many a forced landing in cow pastures. Once, he crashed his plane into the kitchen of a farmhouse. On another occasion, he collided with a bull. Once flying from Scottsbluff, Nebraska to Cheyenne, Wyoming, a distance of only 80 miles, he had to land in fields 4 times because it was so cold that the carburetor kept icing. Finally, he gave up, took the mail sack to a farmhouse, borrowed a team and wagon, and drove the last 4 miles to the Cheyenne airport. On one flight, Slim punched a hole in a wing by skimming a mountaintop, and then complained he lost a fountain pen in the process. Lewis survived his airmail career to become an airline captain. He died in Wyoming after retiring from the airlines. Randolph Page was the first to deliver mail on the night flight. With the nickname of Dizzy, he was known to enjoy a drink or two, and on one occasion he loaded the westbound mail at Chicago and said he might just take it right downtown in Moline to the postmaster himself. And sure enough, flying over Moline, Page roared full speed along the main street and dropped the mail sack out of the bottom half of a slow roll. Then, just to be sure they wouldn't miss it, he made a steep 180-degree turn. Upon seeing this, the postmaster said, "God almighty, folks, get back inside. Here he comes again." Randy Page left the mail service after an accident. Some said it was due to drinking, but Page denied these allegations. He then took part in air racing and flew in 2 Ford Air Tours, passing away from illness at the age of 36. Reports made by postal aviators to the Post Office Department showed that among the most dangerous routes was the Long Island to Cleveland flight, with a refueling stopover at Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. The danger was due to the unpredictable weather patterns and the variable wind velocities of the Allegheny Mountains. Mainly the valleys and cities would be blotted out by the early morning ground fogs, leaving only the tops of the ridges exposed as landmarks to aviators. The long, low ridges that roll across central Pennsylvania are hard to read from the air, fall prey to violent weather changes, and have little in the way of flat clearings for forced landings. This path was dreaded by pioneer flyers. With aviators forced to navigate by landmarks over mountainous country in rough weather, crashes were inevitable. Between 1918 and 1927, 43 postal pilots were killed. This mountain range contributed to the high rate of accidents and deaths, and became known to the pilots as the Hell Stretch. A 1921 Mail Pilot's Manual demonstrates the difficulty in finding the air routes. On top of the mountain, just south of a gap in the Bald Eagle Range at Bellefonte, may be seen a clearing with a few trees scattered in it. This identifies the gap from others in the range. The mail field lies just east of town and is marked by a large white circle. QB Charles Ames fell prey to this dangerous flight path. En route to Bellefonte from New Jersey, on a night when clouds sagged below the Allegheny peaks, he vanished on October 1st, 1925. The field manager anxiously checked nearby emergency strips, and then stood on the field listening for an engine that never came. More than 1,000 searchers combed the hills east and west of town for the next 9 days. Finally, Ames's splintered aircraft and broken body were found near the summit of a mountain a few miles from the Bellefonte field. He was 31 years old. Ames missed a gap in the Allegheny Mountains due to barometric pressure changes. Flying into extreme low pressure, His altimeter read 200 feet high. Ames's accident inspired barometric pressure questions on flight exams even today. Known as Ham, QBE Hamilton Lee was an airmail pilot from the start of the Post Office airmail service all the way until the CAM service in 1927. Among the many aviation milestones credited to Ham, one of those was his participation in the country's first pilots' strike. To prove to Congress that airmail was reliable, Post Office officials insisted that the mail be flown in all kinds of weather. Consequently, Lee and other airmail pilots took off in fog so soupy they couldn't see their wingtips, or across their airfield cinder runways, and they flew into the blackness of thunderstorms that battered their fragile craft like a leaf. Ham remarked, "At the start we had no radios, no parachutes, and few instruments. We flew mostly by landmarks, when we could see them. In a fog or thick clouds, we just flew by the seat of our pants." In July 1919, on a rainy, cloudy morning with visibility 200 feet and worsening, pilot Leon Smith refused to fly the New York to Washington run until the weather lifted. Assistant Postmaster General Otto Prager, who had never flown a plane, responded with the order to fly by compass, visibility not necessary. Smith again refused, and so did Lee when he was asked to replace him. Both men were fired on the spot. In sympathy, all the pilots in the system went on strike. 3 days later, pilots and management reached a compromise. In times of marginal weather, the field manager would have to go aloft and check conditions himself. If he returned safely, the flight would take place. If the field manager was a Kiwi, he could sit in the mail bin right behind the engine while the pilot circled the field, checking the weather. Under those circumstances, Lee agreed to return and was rehired. Although Lee was one of the oldest and most conservative of the male pilots, he was not immune to accidents. Once, while Lee was in the air, the engine caught fire. To lose altitude fast, he side-slipped. "It kept the flames away from my face and allowed the airstream to blow out the fire," he said. "It was touch and go, but I continued the flight." Ham retired as United Airlines' #1 pilot in 1949. And in 1992, he co-piloted a DC-3 at the age of 100, a gift from his fellow QBs. When Ham finally passed away at the age of 102, he was known as the flyingest man in the world. Recording over 4 million miles in the air, Ham once said, "There are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots." The Post Office Department's direct involvement over airmail would come to an end on February 2, 1925, when Congress passed the Kelly Act, directing the department to contract with commercial air carriers to survey, establish, and operate service over a variety of designated new routes, flying them over contract airmail, or CAM. 34 CAM routes would eventually be established across the country. Giving the airmail to fledgling airlines was one way to support the new airline industry. Due to an alleged airmail scandal of corruption and favoritism between members of Congress and private airlines, the airmail was taken over by the Army in 1934. The results were nothing short of disastrous. During the short period of time that the U.S. Army took charge of the airmail, they lost several lives during preparation to fly the mail. During their 78-day operation, they lost 12 lives and had 66 crashes before temporary contracts with private carriers were put into effect. After much public outcry, the airmail was given back to the airlines. There were no books or predecessors that they could learn from. They were writing the rules as they went. The science wasn't proven, and they had yet to develop the tools we take for granted. They gave their health and well-being, and many gave their lives, so that we could have the knowledge to fly safely today. A drizzling rain was falling. A nearby clock tolled 8. They watched the sky with an eager eye, for the westbound mail was late. The rain beat down on the old tin roof. The hangar chief stood by. Then the drumming tone of a motor's drone came from the misty sky. The beacon sent its welcome beam to the rider of the night, and he brought her down on the soggy ground up to the landing light. They swap the mail and shout, "Okay!" Then she roars and lifts her tail. She's up again in the snow and rain, on with the westbound mail. The dim, blurred lights of a city loom in the space below. Their work is done, but the mail flies on and on through the blinding snow. Rain is freezing on her wings. She seems to feel the weight. It'll soon be dawn. She staggers on, hoping she won't be late. Crystals stick on the windshield, forming a silvery veil. Icy struts and a man with guts and a sack of westbound mail. Over the peak of a mountain now, clear of the treacherous rim, away up there in the cold night air, just God and the mail and him. His thoughts turn back to a summer night and a girl not long ago, who shook her head and firmly said, "As long as you're flying, no." He tried to quit this bloomin' job and stick to the concrete trail, but the wish came back for the canvas sack and the feel of the westbound mail. The wind kept whispering secrets it had heard the stars confide, so back he went to the big blue tent, back to the long black ride. The sleet and snow were far behind before the night was gone. Out of the rain the gray dawn came and found him flying on. He tilted her stick and banked her in. She seemed to feel the gun and voiced her wrath of the cinder path at the end of a perfect run. 3 points touched, and she taxied in up to the hangar rail. He stretched a grin as they checked him in on time with the westbound mail.